Tucker Carlson is very concerned about the war on men. But Tucker Carlson, I keep saying, you got to follow this guy because he, like Trump, he's the media equivalent of the person who is going to say things that have some real social and political truth and then utterly twist them for a reactionary imagined past. Also, I like to work on my Tucker impression. Like, is that sexist? I can't say that anymore. Here is Tucker Carlson talking about, and I guess apparently picking a story, which if this is true.
I don't know if they go into that story.
Yeah, that story. Okay. The Chiron begins with kindergarten teacher bans boys from Lego. Well, if that's true, that's incredibly stupid. But anyways, let's go on.
To them from learning. Girls thrive when boys fail. This is the underlying assumption of much of America's gender policy and education. There is no credible research to suggest that is true. It is purely an ideological belief. And yet that assumption is pervasive, especially on college campuses. Now that's ironic because there are more than 2 million more women than men enrolled in college this year. On most campuses, men are a distinct minority. At Carlow University in Pittsburgh, women outnumber men by more than 6 to 1. And yet almost every campus has a women's studies department. In many of them, the stated goal is to fight expressions of masculinity and disempower men. At Ohio State, a course is underway this spring called Be a Man, Masculinities, Race, and Nation. The syllabus for that course explains that masculinity is used to, quote, justify certain kinds of violence by men. On the first day of class, students were required to consult a male privilege checklist.
I just want to pause
At Duke University.
People know that I have a lot of wariness of some of this type of content, but certain kinds of masculinity used to justify violence is like, that's as close as social science would get to a 3 + 3 = 6 statement. Like, that's obvious.
Have you seen a Western before?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Privilege checklist. At Duke University in North Carolina, a 9-week workshop met to devise ways to undermine, quote, masculinity and maleness, as well as to create destabilized spaces for those with privilege, meaning men. Similar projects have sprouted at colleges all over the country. Under the Obama administration, the Department of Justice created something called the Healthy Masculinity Campus Athletics Project. The coordinator of that program at Wheaton College summed up its objective this way, quote, as a country, we need to do a better job of addressing issues around toxic masculinity. Left unasked was the most basic question of all. Is masculinity itself really toxic? And what happens to boys when we tell them that it is? It's widely understood that attacking people for their basic nature is unhealthy, and it's wrong. A government-funded program designed to fight toxic femininity or toxic homosexuality probably would not escape the scrutiny of Congress or the media. At the very least, its supporters would have to explain why our country needs a program like that. And yet nobody has been forced to explain why boys who are already failing need to be held back further. And so they are.
So there's a lot going on there. First of all, essential nature is a pretty contested comment across any of these boards. Number two, Congress would be all over it. I think actually a lot of members of Congress are pretty all over targeting, Muslims for their supposed essential nature, as an example. The new national security advisor to the president is a virulent bigot and conspiracy theorist and warmonger when it comes to Muslims. And also, we have an administration targeting transgender rights, and still a vast majority of Republicans do not support equal civil rights for gay, lesbian, or transgender people. Setting all that aside, this is a thing, though, that I'm obviously really wary and kind of burned out on sort of, toxic masculinity and these other sort of like rhetorical cultural studies tropes. And I think that the limits of this type of analysis are really exhausting itself. And partially it's because, yes, there's an open lane there for disingenuous, hucksters and promoters of all sorts of various bigotries like a Tucker Carlson, but also because so many things are being conflated there. Like, is there male privilege? Absolutely. Should that be assessed and interrogated and thought about on a variety of levels? policy, social, economic, of course. Is that distinct from a weird sort of social environment where people use words like toxic masculinity as a cliche, and in fact it does become kind of like weird and emotionally toxic and off-putting to normal people? Yeah, in some cases it certainly does. The other thing that's going on there is like what were you talking about, Matt, before? This is a really important point. I want to bring you in on this. The education myth there. Like, that's actually what's being criticized. This notion that education can close these gaps. There's still a gender pay gap where men get paid more than women. There's still all these other various inequalities and disparities that run across everything. And the liberal technocratic myth has that been education will take care of it. So we both actually do have a situation where boys are, in some cases, struggling in schools. These, college numbers are evening out, and yet those disparities persist. Why? Because education is not what's going to answer them, leaving another giant open lane for disingenuous, xenophobe, stealth alt-right bullshit from Tucker Carlson.
If anything, what's really happening is the sort of psychic trauma of the men Tucker's talking about is because people like Tucker have been trying to give them this inheritance of masculinity, that they can continue to do this even without going to college. They can have their place in society, right?
Right.
And we're not in that anymore. And that's what Tucker's speaking about. But he blames the rise of like women going to college because that was how it was seen. Like, this is how you're going to like close that pay gap, or this is how you're going to get into society. That model made more sense for them, or it was just, greased or whatever. And that's not there for men, and it's interesting.
Right, and I think, though, that this is also where, like, the other area which is both right and decent and just and leaves less room for demagogues to exploit is, like, again, look, if the choices are a capitalist apartheid hierarchy built on basically systems of looping wealth and privilege for affluent white men and a sort of parasite state of capital and government, which is how things have mostly functioned in Western capitalist societies, and obviously places like apartheid South Africa, and is the system that Fox News is designed to promote and pine for and see being under threat every second. If that's one alternative, and then the other alternative is a hyper neoliberal capitalist state riven by structural inequality, people working themselves to death, massive exploitation on the supply chain, and corporate abuse. But within that, we've moved socially, so we recognize how wrong and disgusting racism, sexism, and all these other isms are, and at least there's some room, although you can't really address those things fundamentally without addressing economics, but at least there's some room for advancement. You can have, Tim Cook is, I believe, I don't know if is Tim Cook out? Tim Cook is out as the first, gay man. He runs Apple. It's one of the most important. So that to me is like sort of a peak example of that. On one hand, that's enormous social progress, that someone with that amount of power can be open in their sexuality, a sexuality that's, been historically repressed and violently and legally in this society, and still is in many cases, but it's a form of progress. Now, Apple is an utterly predatory, unethical, and abusive company, which literally, is hoarding wealth, has sweatshops in China. I mean, all of the pathologies of modern capitalism. So if the debate is traditional white capital hierarchy versus neoliberal capitalist exploitation with diversity, I'll pick the latter. But the only road to actually really dislodge both has to be those types of universal programs and delivery that make it so it isn't all just a game of basic survival. Because that's the other, I think, really horrible thing that's getting bled together right now. Like, in Tucker's audience, I guarantee you there are people who are the most, there are millionaires, and it's all cultural bullshit, and they have nothing's going to dislodge them in life, and they just miss being able to, openly tell racist jokes or not hire a woman or harass their assistant, okay? That's a major part of the audience in the Republican Party. But there's also there's also another person watching this shit who makes $35,000 and is struggling like hell and thinks that they're talking to him. And he faces a completely different set of cultural conditions and is like, toxic masca, what? Pay my fucking bills. And unless that is bridged and we get out of all of that morass, I mean, there's going to be a marketplace for Tucker Carlson, and nobody does it better than him. That's it. It's actually another difference between him and, like some idiot like Rubin. I mean, it's funny. Dave Rubin has nothing is put in any type of economic context, even if it's for, to demagogue and justify traditional oppression, which is his game.